And with the horrific images and hate-filled language out of Virginia over the weekend, many parents are probably wondering how much of it that their children should be exposed to, and also how do you talk to your kids about hate and also hate mongers. So we welcome now Professor Beverly-Jean Daniel from the School of Child and Youth Studies at Ryerson University. And you know, many parents maybe just don't know how to verbalize this with their children, because perhaps they've seen some of this in their own children's lives, obviously on a very smaller scale though.
Well, I think it's important for parents to recognize that kids are seeing lots of information, right? If you open the average children's book, it's got information about gender and race and class and body size and all of those things. So kids are exposed to it, and when it shows up on the television, right, I think it is important for parents to begin to say, what do you think is happening? What's your understanding? What makes you uncomfortable about what you're seeing? Because I think a lot of parents don't seem to understand that not talking to their children about it can actually be much more difficult for the kids than talking to them about it.
Well, I was going to ask you that, because some parents might feel, oh, this content is too graphic, I don't want them to see it, I want to insulate them from, and they want to change the channel. Is that a good thing? But you're saying no.
Well, what I'm saying is that even if you look at Disney movies, Disney movies, if you do a critical analysis of it, are extremely problematic. But we will plop our kids down in front of the television and say to them, go ahead and watch some Disney movies for a few hours, right? And what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that parents have to have their kids watch an entire broadcast of something, but if your child comes across something on the television, if they see something that's happening, rather than just switching the channel and pretending it didn't happen, why not say to them, what do you think is happening there? Right? And then you turn the television off and say, well, let's talk about what you think you saw. Right? But it doesn't mean that you have to allow the kids to watch the entire breadth of whatever it is that's happening. But you can take snippets of it to begin to have the dialogue. Right? What did you see? What do you think you heard? What do you understand? And then let me try to help you understand and frame what just happened.
A more challenging conversation maybe with parents and their teenage children, because teenagers have gone through some pretty wide-ranging experiences that they might not have shared with their parents in the past, and perhaps you know, children, especially who are visible minorities, even in Toronto, may have experienced racism that they have not talked to their parents about.
Absolutely. I would make the argument that it's highly unlikely that a child who's racialized hasn't experienced racism in Canada, in Toronto. They may not have the language to understand what has happened, or they may not be able to analyze it or understand it as racism. But I often say to youth, it's not if racism is going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, how often it's going to happen, and how hard you're going to be hit by it, right? So the kids have experienced it, but we haven't provided the outlets for them to speak about it, because us as adults, we want to keep it quiet. Right? When you look at the way in which institutions handle racism, what happens? Let's sweep it under the carpet, let's pretend it didn't happen, let's package it nicely and shift it aside. But even if it's something that's happening in the media, right? Check in with your teenagers to say, have you heard about X, Y, and Z? Right?
To be proactive.
To be very proactive.
And be that listening ear?
Absolutely, all right? Something happens in the news, I check in with my kids to say, oh, have you heard about the shooting? Have you heard about the violence that's happening in the U.S. right now? What do you think are the parallels to that in a Canadian context? Do you think things like that are going to happen here or could happen here? What happens if you see something like that happening? What do you do? How do you respond? How do you manage it? So irrespective of the age of the child, I think it is absolutely incumbent upon us as parents to have those dialogues, and particularly as parents of racialized children. Right? Don't leave your kids to find out that racism is coming. Right. Right? I'm thinking have that conversation well in advance. So
give them an outlet.
Absolutely. So when it shows up, they can come back to you and say, remember that time you talked about X, Y, or Z? Well, it happened today.
Can you share your own personal experiences with your children?
Oh, absolutely.
That's okay.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things, as someone from the Caribbean, I often critique in terms of how we've been raised, is that everything becomes a secret. So the mistakes that happen, nobody talks about that. And And I think it is very important for us to be able to say, here's what I experienced, and here's how I dealt with it. Here's what I learned from it.
Wonderful.
Right? But I think keeping it a secret, irrespective of the topic, whether it's race, whether it's violence, whether it's gender, we really do need to have those conversations with our kids because it better prepares them for it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Beverly. Appreciate your wisdom.
My
Thank you.
pleasure.